I think that there has been an underlying informing idea about leadership, which I think originated, or was certainly given a major shove, by Frederick Taylor in the 1900s, and we call it Taylorism. Everyone familiar with Taylor? Yeah. So he was, I guess, he was the initiator of time management, method study, all those things. That if we measure work, he was, for those who don't know Taylor, I think he was South African. He started working in the South African mines. He came up with the idea that if we measure work and we measure aptitude and we match aptitude to work, then it'll be much more efficient. So this core idea that we can somehow or other make work measurable and scientific started with Taylor. Then I think Max Weber, or Weber I should say, had a major influence. He introduced the idea of put a lot of emphasis on structure and bureaucracy, and these two guys, Weber and Taylor, I think have had a very potent influence in thinking about management and thinking about management as a science. And there's also quite a strong desire by the management population to be professional, because they rather envied, I think, doctors, barristers, lawyers, and so they were keen that management would be somehow legitimized and made respectable by being a profession. And the Enlightenment period, the professional thing was to join the scientific community and say management is a science. So I think that management became a science. I remember being sent in as a fairly young consultant to allegedly rescue a firm of retail off licenses. And I won't tell you how successful or otherwise I was, because I wasn't very successful. But I do remember them assuring me, we subscribe to scientific management here, Mr. Critchley. No worries. So I remember this term was very important to them. And I think the characteristics of scientific management, I think, are still embedded in how we think about management. The notion that management should be objectivity, the notion that we should be rational, somehow the idea that we can stand outside the bit of the organization we're responsible for, we can analyze it, we can decide where the leverage points are, and we can find ways of measuring. That famous adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, was very popular. I personally believe that if you follow that maxim, then you only manage about 10% of what goes on in organizations. In my view, about 90% of what happens is not measurable, and we spend an awful lot of time trying to measure things that aren't actually measurable, and I'll say a bit more about that. And we also have an emphasis on managers looking for tools and instruments, so they kind of behave like scientists needing instruments and tools. And I think part of that is embedded in management development with competency frameworks. So how many organizations develop a competency framework, then develop a development process around them, and it's very mechanistic. And in my experience, somehow or other, a bit like the famous Shakespearean quotation, full of sound and fury, lots of effort and signifying not very much. It doesn't actually make much difference. Now, one of I think the problems with this scientific approach and all the methods that have developed over the years, and the methods that business schools have taught, and I went to business school and I learned how to do discounted cash flow. As Ralph Stacey says in his latest book, which I think I saw Tim had brought with him, and I've done quite a bit of work with Ralph Stacey, he said there is very little evidence. If you are a real scientist, there we are, complexity and organizationality, then you need evidence that things work as they're supposed to work. He said there's very little evidence that any of the management techniques actually work. So, for example, no strategy ever produces the strategic intent that it's supposed to. They just don't, because life changes. In my experience, no change initiative ever produces the desired outcomes. At Ashridge we did some research, and 90% of the change programs failed according to the criteria that they'd been set. No budget ever produces the actual numbers the budget is supposed to produce. And no discounted cash flow analysis actually measures whether one investment is going to work better than the other in practice. And most of the evidence suggests that no acquisition, even in terms that it's supposed to, adds value to the shareholders. It usually adds value to the company being acquired, but most of the empirical evidence suggests that acquisitions reduce the overall value of the organisation. So isn't that interesting? Most of the scientific approaches to management don't actually work. And yet, I think it's equally interesting that organisations by and large do work. And I think I'm going to argue that they work because somehow the most managers intuitively know how to improvise. They know how to make things work, despite the mantra of what they are supposed to do. The way that we think about this thing we call an organisation informs the way we then think about leadership and change and developing leaders. And our starting point is to suggest that our thinking about organisations, much of which is fairly unconscious, I would say. We don't often stop and ask ourselves the question, well, what is an organisation then? Occasionally you get that question at a business school. But our thinking about organisations is largely informed, as it's developed over the last 100 years or so, by the sciences of certainty. And by the sciences of certainty, I'm not a scientist, but what I mean by that is that the interest in cause and effect, linear relationships, predicting outcomes through determining cause and effect relationships. And that in an unconscious way, maybe, this has permeated much of our thinking about organisations. And that consequently, the prevalent metaphor is a rather machine-like metaphor, an engineering metaphor. So certainly as I move around organisations, the language suggests, when people talk about leveraging the bottom line, the engineering processes, give me tools, we talk about driving change, the levers of power. It's absolutely riddled with engineering metaphors. And actually, one of the most prevalent process in organisations, performance management, is based on an engineering metaphor, based on cybernetics. Decide on your goal, measure variance against it. So the whole performance management and much of the quality movement is based on engineering ways of thinking. And I think they have serious limitations, actually. So this engineering metaphor, which puts the manager as a scientist, leads us to believe that we can control things in the way that they're not really controllable. And it also casts an organisation as a thing that can be driven or moved. Now, I want to suggest that the recent crisis that Tim referred to really shows that organisations are fundamentally unpredictable. I don't think we could have predicted the crisis as it occurred. A little bit like the butterfly flapping its wings. I can never remember where it flapped its wings. Was it Sao Paulo? And butterfly flapped its wings in Sao Paulo, and there's a hurricane in somewhere a long way away. So people are beginning to realise that sometimes small effects amplify in completely unpredictable pattern shifts. And that what my colleague Ralph Stacey is suggesting, that we would be better to draw on the sciences of uncertainty as a source domain for thinking about organisations. And by the sciences of uncertainty I mean chaos theory, maybe quantum theory, but particularly complexity theory. Because I think if you think about it, an organisation is not a machine. That's obvious, isn't it? But if you go a little bit further, an organisation is not a thing at all. Because it's not in the plant and the machinery, or the buildings, or the employees, or the products, or even the patents, as the lawyers would argue it is. In a sense, it has no existence. looked at from the perspective, a scientific perspective, concerned about objects in nature and trying to determine their characteristics, it has no existence, it has no essence, it has no materiality. As a philosopher said, we make a categorical error when we think about organizations as if they are things with essence and materiality and characteristics which can be measured. So what I think they are, if you think about it, is they are people in interaction. They're communicative processes or social processes. So that's what I'm wanting to just introduce you to, this proposition that organizations are not things that can be described by scientific methods or processes, that they are actually, they're a different, ontologically different. They are people in communicative interaction deciding, how should we do this then? What should our strategy be? How can we make this safe over time? And in a way, that's all they are. An ongoing process of communicative interaction which is continually emerging. Does that make any sense to you as a proposition? Yes, I can see someone nodding. Yes, this is very helpful. This is very helpful. Yes, I need the odd bit of reassurance as I go here.
That's what I thought.
Yes, you read me absolutely. And I wanted just to take this notion of communicative interaction and just explore what that might mean. And a sociologist called George Mead, writing a long time ago, there's nothing new under the sun, writing in the 1930s, came up with this, I think, rather nice aphorism. He said the meaning of the gesture is in the response. Because he was very interested in, well, what is communication then? And he did quite a bit of work with animals. And he noticed if two dogs meet on a walk, and one dog may lie down in a gesture of submission, the other dog may nevertheless sink its teeth into its neck. So even though the dog who lay down intended this as a peaceful gesture, the other dog nevertheless pursues an aggressive line. So what Mead is saying is that although one gesture has an intention, the meaning emerges in how people respond, and then how you respond to that, and so on and so forth. So what he's suggesting is meaning socially arises in communicative interaction, that you can't get out of your head a meaning into someone else's head. Now this is actually very worrying for corporate comms departments, because their whole set of activities is based on the idea that you craft the message, so the executive team goes away to some extremely plush hotel and spends 2 days in a fair amount of turmoil, and then they come up with the new strategy or the change initiative, and then corporate comms get hold of it, they craft it into a nice statement, they then devise the channels of communication, and then they communicate it onto an unsuspecting public, who generally do not respond the way they're supposed to and go marching off into the new dawn, and the senior management is cross, and the communications people think we clearly didn't craft the message right, or we didn't get the channels right, or tell it not in gaff. They are resisting change. How terrible. And what I'm suggesting, the whole thing is based on a complete misunderstanding about how communication happens. Because if you think about it, it's obvious. You will bring your own categories of knowing, your own experience to any gesture, and hence you will shape it through your experience. So it seems obvious, doesn't it, that meaning cannot be communicated from one person to another. You have to have a conversation. Meaning has to emerge, has to evolve. And I think many leaders misunderstand, because I think so much leadership is by communique, by edict, by sending a message, whether it's by email or whatever, and then imagining that they've done the communication job. And so many sessions I've run, and people sit around there and say, the problem in this organisation, no one knows what the strategy is. And the leaders look deeply hurt and offended and said, but we've communicated the strategy. Actually, they haven't talked about it. So no one has had a chance to make sense of it together. So if you think about it, if you think that organisations are an ongoing process of gesture and response. And by gesture, I don't mean just a verbal one, but I mean any communicative move that can be bodily, it can be email, it can be electronic. And it works the way I said, then by definition in the long run organisations are not predictable and not controllable. It's obvious. They are by definition a messy, emergent, unpredictable social processes. That is what I'm saying is the reality that we don't face up to because we have, as you were saying earlier, we have this formal legitimate notion that they're supposed to be controllable and that leaders are supposed to be right and so forth. But it's all, in my view, based on a misunderstanding about what organisations are really like, and which I think the management schools have, contribute to in spades, frankly. I thought you were about to say something. Just the last thing I want to say about this communicative interaction. I mean, here I am, holding forth, gesturing madly to you, but I've got no idea how you are, what kind of sense you're making of it. But I see you smile and nod, and I have a sense that you're agreeing with me. So I'm actually changing my gesture as I go. I'm going on more gladly than I might have done if I saw a load of sombre when I probably got more serious and sweated a lot and tried a lot harder. So there's something very simultaneous about this. It's almost simultaneous. It is not linear. It is non-linear. So if you think that organisations are non-linear complex processes, they are by definition unpredictable. We can't control them. And I think many leaders who have been trained over the years to believe that don't wish to believe this, because if it's not controllable, then what am I to do then? It raises major questions. I was going to say something else and it slipped my memory, so I think I'll carry on. Oh yes, I know what I want to say, I've remembered. In the moment I had a Terry Wogan moment. What did he call them? Senior moments. Of course, it doesn't explain that our experience that there is some predictability in organisations. And I'm not going to go on about this in length, but one of the things that we've learned is that people, particularly working in an organisation and becoming familiar with, patterns and habits and norms develop over time. So we get a sense that there's something real here simply because patterns have emerged. But that's what culture is. It's not anything in particular, it's just something, patterns and habits and routines that emerge over time. So we do have a sense that there is something. But I think once we realise that what we're dealing with is an ongoing social process, it shifts significantly how we think about leadership. There's a guy who used to work in GlaxoSmithKline, did his PhD thesis, he entitled it "In Charge but Not in Control," because he realised, he lived this paradox of being paid to be in charge, but actually realising he wasn't controlling anything. So I rather like that idea. Leaders are in charge but not in control. So what do you do then?
Surely he was in control of being in charge.
What's he saying?
I don't know, but I thought it was amusing.
You mean he might be in control of himself to some extent?
Yeah.
Well, yes, all right.
So he had a sense of himself in terms of his role.
Yes.
But of course you can't control everybody in your team. You've got to give some degree of bandwidth. But
well, you see, yes, it's an interesting point. I happen to think that one of the core qualities of leadership is responsiveness, which and I think you mentioned it is having an empathic ability to hear what's going on and to be flexible enough to respond. If a leader is rigid and fixed in their views, then they're not going to be very effective, or they're going to turn domineering and bullying. By the way, when I say organisations are social processes of communicative interaction, and the last bullet point is, I'm going to shorthand this notion of gesture and response by saying actually conversation is the core process. And I'm not saying that to mean anything ideal. I'm not saying that organisations can choose to be social processes. I'm saying they just are. And part of this communicative process can include bullying, and it can include domination, and it can even include threats of murder that go on in Saddam Hussein's regime. It's still a communicative process. People respond to what they to the gestures that are being made, and a respond may be fearfulness and maybe compliance, but it's still a communicative process. That's what I'm arguing. But I think once you realise that, then leaders will start to think about how their role differently, as being primarily about engaging people in conversation, maybe expressing intentions and then seeing how they land. Tom Peters famously said a leader's job is to say, we're going broadly west. We've no idea how we're going to get there or what the terrain will look like. We'll have to find that out together. That for me is a nice summary of a leader setting some sort of sense of intention, which is their job, and then saying, we're going to have to find out how to get there. It's a nice combination.
Should I take Tom Peters off my side then?
Oh yes. Well, he went a bit, didn't he?
He did a bit, yes.
He got a bit excited by himself.
Yes.
He did say one or two good things. Maybe people will be saying that about us one day. They said one or two good things, but they got a bit excited about themselves. Is this making sense to you?
So by the conversations and the core process, are you talking really around more bottom-up strategy? You talked about setting an intention.
Done quite a lot recently is bringing a lot of people together in a room to talk about the strategy. So 80 people in a room having a strategy conversation. Now you can't actually have everybody in the organisation, and very often it is the leadership population. But what I'm talking about is acknowledging that if we have a more robust process for engaging people in conversations about key things, then we'll get a better outcome. Is it W.E. Gore who make Gore-Tex?
I was just about to start.
Yeah, go on then.
I was interviewing Andy Wallander from W.E. Gore, senior manager.
Yeah.
It's a founding principle that from Bill Gore himself, that senior managers have to have a deep conversation with the relevant staff every time they make a change.
That's right.
And he says, it's an absolute pain, if I'm honest, sometimes.
Yes.
The last thing I want to do is organise a meeting. I'd rather just
do it.
Communicate it. It says it absolutely works.
Yes, that's right.
Because it saves so much repeated communication.
Yeah. But and the other thing is it ensures quality, because it reduces the risk of mavericks going their own way. Because I've always heard that rule as, if you're going to make an important decision, talk to some good people. It's the same. So what they're saying is introduce the safety mechanism of testing your ideas with other people, so that you can't just go unilateral. And a lot of senior leadership thinking is actually unilateral. Leaders come up with their visions in their bath and then announce them, I think. So that's what we're suggesting here. I want to just, I know Tim told me we're getting a bit tight for time, just to introduce you to some complexity ideas. What I've been saying so far is actually social and psychological, and it's common sense. It's been around for years. It's just that it's got pushed into the foothills. I think you were making the point that the Enlightenment project, the drive for efficiency has kind of pushed this notion of organisations, but people have known it for years. Complexity adds something, I think, to this understanding of organisations. And who's familiar with complexity theory? So you know a bit? Well, you probably know more than me, actually.
No, I'm fascinated by the talk. Ralph gave this talk in the early 1990s.
Oh, right, so
What was fascinating about the concept of communication, which everyone bought into, Unilever had 540 companies and 450,000 people.
Yeah.
And the rest of the morning was about how do you communicate with 450,000 people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a showstopper
For him.
It was a very long day. I mean, and I absolutely take your point about it. This has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And the question I'm left with, because I had great empathy with Ralph that day, was why hasn't it caught on? Because it has been around a long time.
Yeah. Well,
I think in small organisations, particularly that grow bottom up, it works for a while, and the size of complex. And Unilever was one of the ultimate example. It was probably not the best company going to start with.
But it doesn't mean that everyone has got to talk to everybody. It just simply means that this is the way in which things get done.
It is. But
Yeah.
the problem with conversation, it infers understanding. So to your point about response, talking to people doesn't mean they'll understand the strategy.
No,
So the response bit is critical, so actually you do end up having to talk to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Otherwise, because I've had a conversation with you, I've fulfilled a duty. Doesn't mean I understand your strategy any better than when you thought about talking to me.
Isn't that still, though, imagining that because...
What I'm saying is we're introducing a different way of thinking, and then we have to work out for ourselves, well, if this is the nature of organisations, then what do we do? How can we do things in a different way? It's not offering recipes, and of course recipes and how to do this are much beloved of organisations and indeed consultants. You know, most of us consultants make our money on piggybacking on the machine metaphor, and the core management belief which you were referring to, that out there's the right way to do this. And of course the consultants know the right way to do it, which is why they get brought in, and then they impose the right way and it doesn't work. There's a wonderful book called In Bad Company, which is about written by some New York journalists about a succession of consulting interventions, each one predicated on the basis that the last one didn't work because you didn't implement it properly. And in the end, there were more consultants' cars in the car park than there were employees. It's a very interesting little, rather worrying little book actually for us consultants.
But when you say you don't know what to do, we do have some ideas, don't we? I mean,
see rising anxiety in my colleague. Yes, I do have some ideas, but I don't know. I have some ideas, but I don't know. That's the point. But so there is. I mean, it's interesting how emotional intelligence is now getting on the agendas. But my general proposition is that one of the leader/manager's role, and I'm not very happy about the distinction between the two, is that they're conveners of conversations, actually. And how you do that is a very interesting matter. And then the quality of the conversation is another very interesting matter. But I just wanted to introduce you to this little bit of complexity theory. I'm not a complexity scientist. I'm giving you the highlights. The scientists in Santa Fe who were interested in complexity ideas, which mainly were in the area of physical science actually, but a group of them said, I wonder whether these ideas have some relevance to social processes, to organizations, and they designed a computer simulation. Remember the limitations here, it's still a simulation they designed. And they designed it with a number of small programs, computer programs, which they called agents. So it was an agent-based computer simulation. And they programmed each agent with some very simple rules about what to do when you bump into the next agent. That was all. Now the important thing about this is there was no overall blueprint for how the simulation should work, just local rules if you bumped into another agent. And they set the simulation off. And this is a sort of aha moment, because what emerged, unpredictably, was a pattern. When they bumped into one another, a pattern emerged. It wasn't a pattern that could be predicted from the rules, but it was a pattern, and it wasn't entirely consistent. It was a rapid pattern. And so, as Stuart Kaufman, who wrote an amazing book called At Home in the Universe, said, isn't it amazing? Order emerges for free. We don't have to make it happen. And I think that's a great message to managers. When you say to a manager, why do you have to control this? Why can't you just give a broad indication of what you're wanting and then lead people to it? He says, because there'll be chaos. There'll be anarchy if I don't tell them what to do. If you say to them, well, actually, you're wrong. There won't be. People will find their way of doing it. Now, this simulation, of course, was rather basic. And then it led to a number of people saying, all I've got to do as a manager is set a few simple rules and the pattern I want will emerge. You see what happens? Our desire to control clicks in so quickly. And they increased the complexity of the simulation by giving each agent rules of replication. And they discovered, the next amazing thing they discovered was that not only did a pattern emerge, but the computers started to change the rules they were given. So different patterns emerged. A pattern would emerge, then it would disappear, then another pattern would emerge, and they began to think, this looks a bit like organizational life, how patterns emerge because we are agents. We have our rules, we have our values. We've been acculturated by the organization. So this seems to me to account for how patterns arise in organisations, how culture, how norms arise, and how they can be quite persistent, actually, over time, particularly with a group of people who've developed it. And it's often rather